Welcome to North American Borderlands History. I am Brandon Morgan and I am the professor for this class. I'm looking forward to working with all of you this summer semester and getting to know you better and also learning from all of your insights on the concept of borderlands in North America and how that's shaped the history of different peoples and the nations of the North American continent. So that's sort of our goal for this semester, is to look at the existing North American states, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, from the borders. We're going to take a long chronological approach. The course begins by looking at the historiography of Borderlands history. There are links to what historiography is in the first module and the second one. But essentially, historiography is the history of history. So it's how did a unique field called Borderlands history come about, and what is it all about? What kinds of questions does it ask, and how does it approach the issues of North American history differently than, say, looking at the history of Mexico or looking at the history of the United States individually? What can we learn by looking at these places from the margins, from the peripheries? Also, what different ways are there of defining borderlands? Do they have to be geographic regions? Are they set in place, or can they be much more conceptual in terms of the boundaries between different groups, ethnic groups, and so on in a given society? So we have a lot of big questions with this class. Something I wanted to point out here at the beginning of the term is that due to the nature of Borderlands history, what it is looking at places where different cultures, societies meet, where they come into conflict, where new accommodations are made, where the power of nation states is asserted but also not at its strongest necessarily. With all of those kinds of things at stake, Borderlands is very much a conceptual and theoretical kind of field. So it's not quite as grounded in one single historical narrative that is Borderlands history. As we'll learn more about, for most of the 20th century and even into the early 21st, when somebody said Borderlands history, they were essentially talking about US-Mexico, the history of the Spanish borderlands, as Herbert Eugene Bolton dubbed them in the 1920s. So Borderlands history in the last 15, 20 years has grown out of that and started to gain applications in other areas. So there are also questions of how applicable this kind of notion of Borderlands history is to places that aren't the US-Mexico borderlands. What unique forces are at play in other border regions that either aren't in play in the US-Mexico border or that aren't kind of as significant there. So as with most history classes, there probably will be more questions that arise than necessarily definitive answers as we study the borderlands this semester. But again, I just wanted to let you know right off the bat, we're going to be thinking about concepts and theories. We're going to be looking at historical narratives from different nations. So we won't just be revisiting familiar stories from US history or even Southwestern history, but we'll also be looking at Mexican history and Canadian history and how we need to have knowledge of these kind of broader national histories in order to bridge the borderlands, in order to make the connections and kind of see the power that Borderlands history can have for helping us gain new insights on our relationship as members of the North American continent. I am going to provide a couple of links on reading strategies. As you've probably already noticed, this is a reading and writing intensive course. History is just necessarily as a discipline built on reading, writing, analyzing historical texts. So we'll be doing quite a lot of that this semester. But what I want you to do is kind of focus your reading, read analytically, read for argument, read for evidence and interpretations as we go through the course, rather than just reading straight through from cover to cover. You may still need to read straight through from cover to cover. I mean, each of us individually has to figure out what kind of reading strategies work best for us and fit best for us. But I have a couple of links to different suggestions. One of them is a grad student blog talking about how to read for argument and analysis in 2 hours. So it's reading a book in 2 hours. You don't necessarily have to push through them all that fast. But again, if you can expedite things, that's helpful, because I know that we all have busy lives beyond this class as well. But again, we're trying to look at this kind of broad conceptual field as it's changed over time. Also, to end with here, in this video, there is method to the organization of the course. Hopefully it's somewhat apparent, but it's roughly chronological. We begin with historiography, then we move to indigenous borderlands, looking at the period of contact between Europeans and indigenous people. We're going to do that through Rebecca Jager's book on different women figures that were cultural intermediaries between their tribes and European newcomers. Their names have been kind of made legend since their own lifetimes. So we're going to use that as a way into thinking about what the borders looked like at that time, when there weren't kind of fixed national boundaries drawn on the ground to mark territories, but instead they were cultural borders, they were linguistic borders, ethnic borders, and those kinds of things. Then we're going to move on in the middle of the course to look at the development of nation states. We're going to read 2 books that focus on that. Little's book on loyalties. Essentially what he's writing about is the way that national identities sort of took shape in the Canadian-US borderlands in the Northeast during the War of 1812, between that time and 1840. With Brian DeLay's book, The War of a Thousand Deserts, we're going to look at the role that indigenous people played in the US-Mexico War, not just in terms of national and ethnic identity, but also kind of recognizing that Comanches and Apaches were a power to be reckoned with when that war was taking place. But both of these events on the Canadian-US and the US-Mexico border were key events in shaping the contours of the nation, kind of defining where nations ended and began in North America and what kind of power they would hold at the margins. At the end of the class, we're going to focus on more modern issues that have to do with borderlands and the nation state. So again, this is pretty thematic, although it's roughly chronological. We'll be thinking about migration, the problem of immigration restriction that has been very much a borderlands issue, but has also captured national attention in Mexico, the United States, and even Canada in recent years. And we're also going to look at drug trafficking and the drug wars that also have captured attention in recent years. And think about the ways in which all of these things help us to understand borderlands, how they change from the kind of pre-colonial not lines on the ground to these more fixed, at least in our imagination, lines that demarcate territories of states. So I will end it there. That was a little more than I wanted to, or I went on a little longer with this introduction video than I had intended, but I think that this will give you an important introduction to how the class works thematically and what we'll be doing this semester. Please always ask questions whenever you have them. I'm more than happy to help out.